Many African Americans trace their lineage back to Africa, believing their ancestry primarily lies in the continent's diverse cultures, with smaller contributions from Native American and European heritage. Genetic studies commonly support this belief, revealing that African Americans, on average, have 73.2% African DNA, 24% European DNA, and 0.8% Native American DNA. Because of this, the prevailing assumption has always been that their ancestors were primarily African slaves who were brought to the Americas. But what if this widely accepted narrative is incomplete, or even misleading? It may come as a surprise to learn that, according to compelling evidence, nearly 98% of African Americans can actually trace their lineage to Native American communities. The real question is, why has this truth been obscured for so long? And what is being hidden from the public? For centuries, tens of millions of Native Black Americans, indigenous people of the Americas, lived and thrived on this land long before Columbus ever set foot on it. Yet, this critical chapter of history has often been glossed over or deliberately suppressed. The impact of this concealment raises many questions about the historical narratives we've been taught. If you're curious to uncover the truth behind this historical deception and what it means for African American identity today, you'll want to explore this perspective further. It's time to confront the reality that has been kept out of sight for generations. For centuries, it seemed as if Native American communities had vanished entirely from the historical narrative, especially after the arrival of European settlers in 1492. But what happened next? While the world focused on the transatlantic slave trade, a crucial and often overlooked aspect of history unfolded. Slaves from India, often referred to as Black Indians, were sold to European and African slave traders. This reality challenges much of what we've been taught about the origins of slavery in the Americas. Instead of a massive influx of Africans to the New World, historical records indicate that it was these Black Indians who were taken from their homelands in America and transported to Europe. From there, they were traded and sent to Africa in exchange for resources. When they eventually returned to the Americas, they were reclassified as African slaves, having been mistakenly identified as African Americans, a misidentification that has shaped much of the narrative we know today. This pivotal part of history has been left out of school curricula, concealing the truth about the role of Native Americans in the colonial slave system. European powers, including the English, French, and Spanish, systematically used Native Americans as slave labor for the construction of cities, the development of plantations, and the extraction of resources from mines. The practice was not limited to one nation. It was widespread among all European colonizers in North America. The Caribbean, in particular, became a key destination for these enslaved Indians, where their labor fueled the burgeoning colonial economies. Records from the original English colony of Carolina, South Carolina, provide some of the most reliable evidence of this practice. Between 1650 and 1730, it is believed that the English shipped at least 50,000 Native Americans to their Caribbean colonies, with many more likely transported in secret, bypassing tariffs and taxes imposed by the colonial governments. This hidden history reveals that more Native Americans were exported than imported between 1670 and 1717, and the consequences of this brutal trade were devastating. Slavery, far more than any natural disaster or military conflict, decimated indigenous communities along the southern coasts of America. In 1704, colonial governments enacted laws that mandated Native American military service in wars, effectively entangling them further into the economic and political strategies of the colonial powers. These powers had already been shaping Native American societies long before the American Revolution, using the fur trade in the Northeast, the plantation system in the South, and the mission system in Florida to exert control. The fur trade uprooted many Native American communities, forcing them to migrate southward, while the plantation economy in the South further fragmented their societies. Through it all, the exploitation of Native Americans as a labor force continued, often unnoticed by the broader public, hidden beneath layers of misinformation and suppression. This complex and painful chapter of history demands our attention. It's time to confront the reality of how Native Americans, particularly Black Indians, were crucial to the development of the Americas, and how their story has been intentionally erased or overlooked for centuries. Understanding this forgotten history can reshape the way we view the legacy of colonialism and the role of Native American communities in shaping the modern world. For centuries, it seemed as if Native American communities had vanished entirely from the historical narrative, especially after the arrival of European settlers in 1492. But what happened next? While the world focused on the transatlantic, slave trade, a crucial and often overlooked aspect of history, unfolded. Slaves from India, often referred to as Black Indians, were sold to European and African slave traders. This reality challenges much of what we've been taught about the origins of slavery in the Americas. Instead of a massive influx of Africans to the New World, historical records indicate that it was these Black Indians who were taken from their homelands in America and transported to Europe. From there, they were traded and sent to Africa in exchange for resources. When they eventually returned to the Americas, they were reclassified as African slaves, having been mistakenly identified as African Americans, a misidentification that has shaped much of the narrative we know today. This pivotal part of history has been left out of school curricula, concealing the truth about the role of Native Americans in the colonial slave system. European powers, including the English, French, and Spanish, systematically used Native Americans as slave labor for the construction of cities, the development of plantations, and the extraction of resources from mines. The practice was not limited to one nation. It was widespread among all European colonizers in North America. The Caribbean, in particular, became a key destination for these enslaved Indians, where their labor fueled the burgeoning colonial economies. Records from the original English colony of Carolina, South Carolina, provide some of the most reliable evidence of this practice. Between 1650 and 1730, it is believed that the English shipped at least 50,000 Native Americans to their Caribbean colonies, with many more likely transported in secret, bypassing tariffs and taxes imposed by the colonial governments. This hidden history reveals that more Native Americans were exported than imported between 1670 and 1717, and the consequences of this brutal trade were devastating. Slavery, far more than any natural disaster or military conflict, decimated indigenous communities along the southern coasts of America. In 1704, colonial governments enacted laws that mandated Native American military service in wars, effectively entangling them further into the economic and political strategies of the colonial powers. These powers had already been shaping Native American societies long before the American Revolution, using the fur trade in the Northeast, the plantation system in the South, and the mission system in Florida to exert control. The fur trade uprooted many Native American communities, forcing them to migrate southward, while the plantation economy in the South further fragmented their societies. Through it all, the exploitation of Native Americans as a labor force continued, often unnoticed by the broader public, hidden beneath layers of misinformation and suppression. This complex and painful chapter of history demands our attention. It's time to confront the reality of how Native Americans, particularly Black Indians, were crucial to the development of the Americas, and how their story has been intentionally erased or overlooked for centuries. Understanding this forgotten history can reshape the way we view the legacy of colonialism and the role of Native American communities in shaping the modern world. The devastating impact of European diseases on Native American populations during the early colonial period cannot be overstated. Many indigenous people perished in large numbers, especially during the transatlantic voyages. By 1676, Barbados had outlawed indentured servitude for Indians, citing the dangerous and violent resistance they posed to being subjugated. But how does this history tie into the claim that the majority of Black Americans trace their roots to Native Black Indians? The answer lies in the shifting dynamics of the slave trade during the late 1700s. As the African slave trade began to overtake the Indian slave trade, Native American women began marrying African men, resulting in the birth of mixed-race children. Over time, the Native American heritage of these individuals became less pronounced, especially as their identity was reshaped by the colonial powers. Public records, which were crucial in defining racial identity, began to list these mixed-race individuals as colored, furthering the colonial objective of erasing visible traces of Native American presence. Birth and death certificates were often altered, especially in states like Virginia, where the racial designation shifted from Indian to colored for many individuals. This bureaucratic manipulation contributed to a profound distortion in the racial landscape of America, particularly in its census data. Census takers, relying on physical appearance to determine racial identity, would sometimes incorrectly label people of mixed heritage as Black rather than Native American. This misclassification was not a random occurrence, but part of a broader system that systematically erased the identities of Native Americans, especially those with mixed heritage, from the historical narrative. As a result, today there exists a Native American population, largely ignored or misunderstood by mainstream society, especially in the Northeast, that shares a deep, often unrecognized connection to Black Americans. One striking example of this erasure can be found in the history of the freedmen of the Cherokee and other so-called five civilized tribes. The Dawes Rolls, which documented Native American enrollment, reflected the complex intersections of race, heritage, and colonialism. These freedmen, who had been enslaved by Native American tribes before and after the Civil War, faced a similar erasure of their true heritage. Their mixed-race ancestry, blending both African and Native American roots, complicates the understanding of their identity. This complex racial identity mirrors that of many modern-day Black Americans, who unknowingly share common ancestry with the native Black Indians of early America. The fight for recognition and restitution continues today. In 2015, the United States government settled a historic $1 billion claim with 645 Native American tribes. However, part of the motivation behind this settlement was the government's concern that more Native Americans, especially those with mixed Black and Indian heritage, might come forward to claim their rightful identity. This could potentially lead to land reparations and further legal recognition. To prevent this from happening, the U.S. covertly set a deadline of December 31st, 2014, for individuals to assert their claims to land and identity. Although that deadline has passed, many are still fighting for recognition. Thousands of Native Americans, some of whom identify as colored, Negro, or simply have no racial classification at all, are still pursuing claims through the United States Supreme Court and, increasingly, through the United Nations courts. This ongoing struggle to reclaim heritage and identity highlights a crucial and often overlooked chapter of American history. It's a story that reveals the deep and complex roots of modern-day Black Americans, which are intertwined with the Native American experience in ways that history has long tried to erase. One might wonder, from what part of the world did these Native Black Americans originate? While it is well established that the majority of Black Americans today can trace their ancestry to Native Black Americans, the next crucial question is, who exactly were these Native Black Americans? To answer this, we must first look at the history of African peoples in the Americas, an often overlooked chapter of history. Renowned historian Dr. David M. Hotep offers a thought-provoking perspective on our shared human past, as he was the first person to receive a doctorate in ancient African ancestry. His research argues that every human being's ancestry begins in Africa, including those who identify as Americans. This assertion calls into question the prevailing narratives of American history, especially when viewed through the lens of Black American heritage. American history books often start their narrative with the familiar story of cowboys and Indians. However, this traditional approach overlooks an essential and earlier part of American history, the presence and influence of Africans long before Christopher Columbus. Dr. Imhotep builds upon this argument, suggesting that the historical accounts we've been taught neglect the significance of African people in the Americas during pre-Columbian times. His work challenges the widely accepted story, proposing that Africans played a foundational role in shaping the history of the Americas. In his groundbreaking book, They Came Before Columbus, historian Ivan van Sertima presents compelling evidence that Africans were in the Americas long before Columbus ever sailed across the Atlantic. Van Sertima meticulously examines a range of archaeological and historical data that suggests a sustained African presence in the Americas, challenging the conventional narrative that places the arrival of Europeans as the beginning of American history. To bolster his argument, Van Sertima delves into several key pieces of evidence. First, he examines the advanced navigational and shipbuilding skills of ancient Africans, suggesting that they were capable of making transatlantic voyages. He posits that the knowledge and technology to cross the ocean could have been developed by Africans long before European explorers set sail. But the evidence doesn't stop there. Van Sertima also draws attention to the striking similarities between African and Native American cultures, particularly in language, art, and religious practices. These shared traits, he argues, are not coincidental, but rather suggest a deeper, interconnected history between the two peoples. Furthermore, Van Sertima investigates the transportation of plants, animals, and textiles between the continents. He highlights the undeniable evidence of cross-continental exchanges, such as the presence of African crops like yams and rice in the Americas, and the presence of American plants like tobacco in Africa. These exchanges imply that contact between Africa and the Americas was not just possible. It was likely and may have been ongoing for centuries before Columbus's arrival. This new perspective on American history does more than challenge conventional wisdom. It forces us to reconsider the very roots of Black American identity. If the ancestors of Black Americans were not solely African slaves brought to the Americas, but rather the descendants of native Black Americans with African roots who had lived on this land for centuries, it reshapes our understanding of history and identity. The story of Black Americans and their connection to native Black Indians is a far more complex and deeply intertwined narrative than previously recognized. As we continue to explore these revelations, it becomes clear that the history of Black Americans is not just a tale of slavery and oppression. It is a story of resilience, survival, and a rich cultural heritage that spans continents and centuries. The evidence presented by Dr. Hotep, Van Sertima, and others brings to light a forgotten history, a history that links Africa, the Americas, and the indigenous peoples of the land in ways we have yet to fully understand. Additionally, Dr. David M. Hotep points to diaries, journals, and oral accounts from early explorers, which reference the influence of African peoples in the New World. These historical records, often overlooked, offer critical evidence that Africans played an active role in exploration and settlement in the Americas long before Columbus's famous 1492 voyage. The accounts of African explorers and their interactions with Native American civilizations paint a compelling picture of African presence in the Americas, challenging the traditional narratives taught in schools. One of the most striking pieces of evidence supporting this theory is the fleet launched by the Malian Empire in 1310. This grand expedition, consisting of 200 master boats and 200 supply boats, demonstrates the advanced seafaring capabilities of West African civilizations. It is a testament to the maritime expertise possessed by African peoples centuries before European exploration. Another notable example comes from 1311, when the Mandingo king led a sea expedition, underscoring the intentional and organized nature of African exploration. These expeditions reveal not only the technological proficiency of African civilizations, but also their ability to navigate vast oceans, reaching lands far beyond Africa. Dr. Imhotep further expands on these ideas in his book, The First Americans Were Africans, calling for a radical reevaluation of traditional history. He highlights the importance of scientific and geological evidence in tracing the early presence of African peoples in the Americas. These pieces of evidence include genetic studies, ancient artifacts, and geological findings that suggest Africans were present in both North and South America well before the Vikings or Columbus. One particularly striking piece of evidence comes from the HMS Challenger expedition between 1872 and 1876, where a photograph taken in Tierra del Fuego, the southernmost region of South America, shows a group of African explorers. Displayed at the Natural History Museum of London, this photograph serves as a tangible reminder of the African presence in the Americas, reinforcing Dr. Imhotep's arguments. What does this all mean for Black American identity today? Dr. Imhotep asserts that the true identity of Black people in the Americas cannot be neatly categorized into a single label. Many individuals are Afro-Indigenous, Black Native, Indigenous and Black, or Black with a tribal identity. By honoring both African and Native American heritages, Black people challenge America's tradition of categorizing individuals into rigid racial groups. They resist the societal pressure to choose between their identities based on appearance or perceived authenticity. Many blend their African and Native identities, using traditional language or creating new expressions that reflect their unique heritage. From the very first contact between Africans and Native peoples, Black and Indigenous ancestors have built communities, formed relationships, and fought against the systems of oppression that targeted them. Despite the hardships they faced, both Black and Native peoples have never been conquered. Instead, they have continuously found ways to resist oppression, creating modes of defiance such as abolition movements, free towns, cross-cultural alliances, kinship ties, and community-building efforts. Their resistance has birthed enduring movements of solidarity and freedom, highlighting their shared commitment to justice and survival. But what does this mean for Black Americans? Are they descendants of African slaves, or are they the descendants of Native Black Indians? And why, one might ask, is this crucial part of history kept hidden? What is the reason for the widespread omission of Black Americans' true ancestry? These are questions that need to be asked, as they challenge not only historical narratives, but also the identity of an entire people. One thing that cannot be ignored is that the ancestry of Black Americans is not a monolithic story. In fact, Black Americans from different parts of the country can trace their family trees to distinct lineages, something that may come as a shock to many. This revelation is influenced heavily by family oral traditions, which serve as vital records of the past, passed down through generations. These traditions are far more than just beliefs. They are a means of preserving cultural artifacts and maintaining a sense of belonging for future generations. For Black Americans, family stories are powerful tools through which elders convey the struggles, triumphs, and resistance of their ancestors. These narratives provide a human face to the broader historical story of Black America, offering insight into migration, survival, and the continuous fight against oppression. The oral tradition connects generations, bridging the gap between different eras and offering a deeper understanding of both individual and collective identity. By preserving these stories, Black Americans maintain a link to their heritage and ensure that future generations continue to respect and honor the legacies of those who came before them. As we continue to explore these rich and complex histories, it becomes clear that the story of Black America is one of resilience, resistance, and a shared journey that transcends borders, cultures, and centuries. The true lineage of Black Americans remains a mystery to many, but by uncovering the hidden truths of their ancestry, we can begin to unravel the full depth of their history. Generations of Black Americans have passed down their stories, and while the specifics may change over time, the core principles and values embedded in these narratives remain largely unchanged. These stories are more than just memories. They reflect the enduring strength, resilience, and cultural identity that have been passed down through generations. In a time when slave owners likely kept inaccurate or incomplete records of the people they enslaved, many Black Americans place their trust in these oral histories, which offer a direct link to their past. These oral traditions have withstood the test of time, providing a deeper connection to their roots than any official record could offer. The first theory about Black Americans' ancestry is that they are descendants of Africans. Numerous DNA studies support this claim, showing that a significant portion of the Black American population has African ancestry. One such study, based on publicly available DNA data, reveals that approximately 55% of Black Americans have African roots. The transatlantic slave trade, which forcibly brought millions of Africans to the Americas, is a historical event that further affirms this connection. Although this horrific chapter in history severed the ties between Black communities and their ancestral homelands, it also provided a common history that binds African Americans together, despite the separation by both time and geography. Despite the trauma of slavery, African Americans have managed to preserve and pass on elements of African culture, creating a rich tapestry of traditions that survive in the face of centuries of oppression. Language, music, dance, spirituality, and food are just a few of the ways African Americans continue to honor their African roots. These cultural markers serve as constant reminders of the enduring legacy of their forebears, celebrating both survival and cultural continuity. An alternative view posits that African Americans can trace their ancestry back not only to Africa, but to the indigenous peoples of the Americas. This hypothesis suggests that many Black Americans can trace their family trees to Native American tribes, reflecting the complex and intertwined histories of African and Native American communities. Over the years, many Black families have passed down stories of Native American ancestry, creating a bridge between African and indigenous cultures that has endured for generations. These oral histories, combined with research into genetic genealogy and historical records, offer compelling evidence of a shared heritage between Black and Native American peoples. Genetic studies have further supported this theory. In addition to African ancestry, many Black Americans carry traces of Native American genetics, indicating a blend of these two powerful heritages. Historical records also provide insight into the relationships between African slaves, freed individuals, and Native American tribes. Marriage licenses, census records, and land deeds offer documented evidence of interactions between these communities, revealing that some Black Americans may indeed trace their lineage to Native American tribes. These records, often overlooked or ignored in mainstream historical narratives, lend credibility to the theory that Black Americans' ancestry is not solely rooted in Africa, but is also deeply intertwined with the indigenous peoples of the Americas. Finally, a third theory suggests that some Black Americans may trace their ancestry to the Hebrew Israelites, a group of ancient Israelites mentioned in the Bible. This belief, while not as widely accepted, is prevalent among certain Black American communities who claim a connection to the ancient Israelites. This theory, though still debated, adds another layer of complexity to the diverse and multifaceted identity of Black Americans. Whether through African, Native American, or even Hebrew roots, these various theories illustrate the rich tapestry of history and ancestry that shapes the identity of Black Americans today. Each of these theories presents a different lens through which to view Black American identity, offering new perspectives on the history of this diverse community. The stories, the genetic evidence, and the historical records all contribute to a deeper understanding of who Black Americans are and where they come from. Ultimately, the question of ancestry is not a simple one, and each individual's heritage may reflect a unique combination of these influences: African, Native American, and even beyond. These theories challenge us to reconsider traditional narratives and embrace the complexity of Black American history and identity. The physical appearance of the Israelites has long been compared to that of Black people, as seen in verses from the Song of Solomon and Lamentations. These biblical references offer a compelling foundation for theories that some Black Americans may trace their ancestry back to the ancient Israelites. Historical records further suggest that the Israelites migrated to different regions of Africa, which many argue played a role in the eventual arrival of Black people in the Americas. Oral traditions within some Black American communities also claim ancestry to the ancient Israelites, reflecting a deep sense of historical identity. Moreover, genetic ancestry testing has been utilized by some to support these claims. DNA analyses seeking out specific genetic markers linked to particular populations have produced startling results, with some Black Americans able to trace their lineage back to the Hebrew Israelites. Alongside this genetic evidence, cultural practices akin to those of the Hebrew Israelites can be found in Black American communities, such as the integration of Hebrew language and customs into religious practices, the observance of biblical holidays, and adherence to dietary laws. While these shared practices could be a result of religious syncretism or broader historical influences, they also suggest a cultural connection between Black Americans and the ancient Israelites. The transatlantic slave trade, which forcibly moved millions of Africans across the ocean, is often cited as the reason for the eventual dispersion of descendants of the Israelites across Africa, and into the Americas. As a result of this forced migration, there are still descendants of Hebrew Israelites living among Black Americans today. This theory offers another layer to the complex heritage of Black Americans, pointing to a deep and diverse lineage that transcends geographical and cultural boundaries. However, the fourth theory on Black American ancestry introduces a stark contrast. Many Black Americans believe they have European ancestry due to the history of sexual exploitation during slavery. The power imbalance between masters and slaves created conditions for sexual relations that were often coercive, leading to mixed-race descendants. These relationships, born from exploitation, have left a lasting impact on many Black American families, where lighter-skinned individuals with more European features were often seen as being of European descent. Some historical records and genealogical studies have lent credence to this theory, showing that European ancestry is indeed a part of the genetic makeup of many Black Americans. The fifth theory suggests that Black Americans may have origins in Latin America and the Caribbean, pointing to the African diaspora spread across the Americas through the transatlantic slave trade. Countries such as the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Trinidad and Tobago, and Jamaica saw the mingling of African, indigenous, and European cultures, which led to the creation of unique hybrid identities. The Caribbean, in particular, became a melting pot of cultures, where African, indigenous, and European elements blended to create rich and diverse communities. Black Americans with Caribbean or Latin American ancestry often feel a deep connection to this larger, transnational African diasporic heritage. Finally, there is the underappreciated sixth theory, which asserts that Black Americans trace their ancestry back to the original Black inhabitants of the Americas, who lived here long before Columbus and the arrival of slavery. This theory challenges the traditional narrative, which often treats Native Americans as a distinct and homogeneous group. In reality, the indigenous peoples of the Americas were as diverse as any other group. And it's not far-fetched to believe that people of different ethnicities, including Africans, lived in the Americas before European colonization. This theory, known as the pre-Columbian African presence in the Americas, suggests that Black Americans may be descendants of the first Africans who settled in the Americas long before Columbus's 1492 voyage. Supporters of this theory point to archaeological evidence and discoveries that suggest Africans were present in the Americas before Columbus. For example, relics from Mexico's Olmec culture show figures with features typically associated with Africa. Other potential signs of early African contact include African-inspired buildings and artifacts in ancient American cultures. Additionally, genetic studies have identified markers linking certain indigenous American populations to African ancestry. The idea of cultural contact between Africans and Native Americans is also supported by linguistic studies and the cultural parallels between the two groups, such as agricultural practices, artistic motifs, and religious beliefs. The stories of early African explorers, such as Abu Bakr II of Mali, who is believed to have sailed the Atlantic before Columbus, and other accounts of African voyages, further suggest that Africans had contact with the Americas centuries before European explorers arrived. These stories, along with the archaeological and genetic evidence, challenge the traditional historical narrative that places the arrival of Europeans as the beginning of the Americas' true history. Now, the question arises, how did Black Americans come to be? While many theories have emerged, there is one undeniable truth. The heritage of Black Americans is as complex and multifaceted as the history itself. It is a blend of African, indigenous, European, and even Hebrew influences, creating a unique cultural identity that has been shaped by centuries of struggle, resilience, and survival. In addition to these theories of ancestry, there is another crucial chapter in Black American history that has often been erased: the legacy of Native Black American tribes. Throughout American history, many enslaved Africans found refuge within Native American communities, where they integrated African heritage with Native traditions. These Native Black American tribes played pivotal roles in resisting colonization, fighting for freedom, and shaping the cultural landscape of the nation. Yet, their stories have often been silenced or ignored. We aim to reclaim these erased histories. By shining a light on the legacies of Native Black American tribes, we honor their contributions to both Native and African American cultures. The story of Black Native Americans is not just one of pain and struggle, but also of resilience, survival, and strength. These tribes fought alongside Native American communities to resist colonization and preserve their way of life, leaving behind a rich cultural legacy that has shaped the history of this nation. Today, we uncover these forgotten stories and celebrate the incredible contributions of these Native Black American tribes.